Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today, I want to take you on a journey through the life of a woman who defied every expectation placed on her. You might know Josephine Baker as the glamorous dancer in the banana skirt, the international star who captivated Paris. But what if I told you she was also a spy carrying coded messages in her sheet music during World War II? What if I told you she stood side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington? Her story isn't just about fame, it's about survival, resilience, and courage in the face of unimaginable odds. From poverty in St. Louis to the grand stages of Paris, from the shadows of espionage to the front lines of civil rights. Josephine Baker lived one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back into her world together. Chapter 1: A Star with a Secret. What if I told you that one of the world's most glamorous celebrities was also living a double life? Not just a performer adored by audiences, but a secret agent who risked everything during one of the darkest times in history. Imagine a woman who could charm kings and queens, fill theaters with laughter and applause, and then quietly slip into the role of spy, carrying messages, hiding intelligence, and saving lives. It sounds like a movie script, right? But this wasn't fiction. This was the real life of Josephine Baker. Before I dive into her journey, I want you to picture the contrast. The spotlight of Paris with Josephine dazzling crowds in her famous banana skirt, and then the shadows of war where she used that same fame as her cover. She wasn't just an entertainer. She became a force of resistance, a voice for equality, and a symbol of courage in the face of unimaginable odds. Her story is one of survival and transformation. She began life in poverty, scarred by neglect and cruelty, yet she reinvented herself again and again until the world could no longer ignore her. From the streets of St. Louis to the grand stages of Europe, from the glow of stardom to the dangers of espionage, Josephine Baker lived many lives. And today, I want to take you back to where it all started. Because before she became a spy, before she became an icon, she was just a little girl named Frida Josephine McDonald, growing up in a world that seemed determined to break her. This isn't just a story about fame or glamour. It's about resilience and how a woman who was underestimated at every turn rose to become one of the most extraordinary figures of the 20th century. So let's begin, not in Paris, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet, unforgiving streets of St. Louis in 1906. That's where Josephine's story truly begins. Chapter 2: A Childhood of Hardship. When we look at someone like Josephine Baker, it's easy to get caught up in the glamour, the photographs, the fame, the wild costumes that made her a legend. But her story doesn't begin with glamour. It begins with hunger, loneliness, and pain. Josephine was born in 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her birth name was Frida Josephine McDonald. Her mother, Carrie, worked as a washerwoman, scrubbing clothes for other families just to put food on the table. She did her best, but the truth is, she was already struggling when Josephine came into the world. Josephine's father abandoned them before she was even born, and the absence left more than an empty chair at the table. It left scars in her relationship with her mother that would follow her for years. Carrie remarried, but the marriage fell apart. By then, Josephine had siblings, and her mother was raising 4 children alone. Poverty was constant. Moving from one place to another, trying to find work, trying to keep a roof over their heads. It's one thing to read that in a history book, but imagine being a child and never knowing if you'll sleep in the same bed from one week to the next. That kind of instability shapes you. It makes you grow up fast. But the hardest part for Josephine wasn't just the poverty. It was the way her mother treated her. People close to the family said Josephine looked just like her father, and that resemblance was a painful reminder for Carrie of the man who had left her behind. Instead of love, Josephine often received bitterness, words that cut deeper than hunger pains, things no child should ever hear. Being told you're unwanted, being told your existence is a burden that leaves a wound you carry for life. At school, life wasn't much kinder. Josephine only owned one outfit, a single dress she had to wear day after day. Kids can be cruel, and they made sure she never forgot it. She was teased, singled out, laughed at. But here's where Josephine's spirit shines through. Instead of crumbling under the cruelty, she learned to turn it around. She realized that if she leaned into the laughter, if she made faces, crossed her eyes, stuck out her tongue, she could shift the attention. Suddenly, the kids weren't laughing at her, they were laughing with her. In that moment, Josephine discovered something that would stay with her forever. Performance could be a shield. Humor could be a weapon. And the stage, even if it was just the corner of a classroom, could be a place of power. But childhood has a way of reminding you how fragile you are. One Sunday, walking home from church with no shoes on her feet, Josephine stepped on a rusty nail. It went straight into her heel. Within days, her foot swelled and turned red, the pain unbearable. At the hospital, a doctor looked at her leg and made a devastating pronouncement: they would have to amputate to save her life. For a little girl who loved to dance, the thought was unbearable. She refused, she fought. And by some stroke of luck, or maybe fate, the doctor held off, draining the wound instead. Miraculously, it worked. Her leg was saved. But the incident was more than a medical scare. It marked the end of what little childhood she had left, because soon after, Josephine was expected to stop being a child altogether and start working. At just 7 years old, she went door to door offering to sweep porches, shovel snow run errands, anything to bring home a few coins. One of the families she worked for was a widow named Mrs. Kaiser. At first, Mrs. Kaiser seemed kind, offering Josephine food and hand-me-down clothes in exchange for cleaning. But kindness turned into cruelty. The work increased, the scolding turned into beatings, and Josephine found herself in yet another home where she was treated less like a child and more like a servant. There was one bright spot, though. Mrs. Kaiser kept animals, and Josephine adored them, especially a rooster she named Tiny Tim. She fed him scraps of her own meals, and in that friendship she found a little bit of comfort. But even that was taken from her. One day, Mrs. Kaiser demanded that Josephine kill Tiny Tim so he could be cooked for dinner. Imagine the heartbreak of being forced to slaughter the only creature that had given you unconditional affection. For a child, that's not just trauma, it's betrayal. And it didn't stop there. When Josephine made a mistake, when a pot boiled over, Mrs. Kaiser's punishments turned brutal. One day she plunged Josephine's hand into boiling water, leaving burns so severe they took weeks to heal. Eventually, Josephine ended up in the hospital again, not from illness or accident, but from deliberate cruelty. She went back to her mother's home, hoping for safety. But safety wasn't something Josephine ever truly knew. Her mother demanded she return to work because in that household, love and survival were conditional. Soon she found herself with another family, the Masons. At first, life there was better. She was given a real, bed-decent food, and even the chance to play with neighborhood children. She turned the basement into her own little theater, staging performances for the other kids. For the first time in her life, she felt a glimmer of what it meant to be a normal child. But that glimmer was short-lived. At night, Josephine began to sense something strange breathing in the dark footsteps near her bed. At first, she thought it was a ghost. But one night, the truth was exposed. It wasn't a ghost. It was Mr. Mason. The horror of that discovery shattered her sense of safety, and when Mrs. Mason found out, instead of protecting Josephine, she turned her away, fired her. She wasn't even 8 years old. 8 years old, and she had already endured poverty, abuse, and betrayal that most adults would never recover from. It's important to pause here because when we tell stories about icons like Josephine Baker, we often jump straight to the fame, the glamour, the iconic performances. But this was her foundation. These were the experiences that shaped her into a survivor. Every scar, every insult, every night she went hungry, they were the fire that forged her determination. And despite it all, Josephine never lost her imagination. She told herself, even in those darkest moments, that one day she would be more than a servant, more than a poor girl with a single dress. She dreamed of flowing gowns of stages, lit just for her, of a life far beyond the narrow streets of St. Louis. It's one thing to dream. It's another to fight for that dream. And Josephine's fight was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The End of Childhood. By the time Josephine was barely 8 years old, she had lived through more than most people face in a lifetime. Abuse, poverty, betrayal. These weren't just chapters in her story, they were the entire fabric of her childhood. And as much as she longed for innocence, the truth is her childhood ended before it ever really began. After being cast out from the Mason household, Josephine returned once again to her mother's cramped, unstable home. You would think a mother would embrace her daughter after such a horrifying experience, but Carrie was not that kind of mother. She was cold, pragmatic, and demanding. To Carrie, Josephine was not a child to be nurtured. She was another pair of hands to help pay rent. So once again, Josephine worked. She polished floors, carried groceries, shoveled snow. She was still just a little girl, but she already carried herself with the weight of an adult who knew that survival was never guaranteed. It's hard to imagine what that does to a child's mind. Most kids at that age are learning multiplication tables, chasing after friends, dreaming about what they want to be when they grow up. Josephine was learning about endurance. She was learning that the world would not protect her, that if she wanted something more, she would have to fight for it with every ounce of her being. In 1917, that truth was hammered in even deeper. That year, racial tensions in St. Louis boiled over. Josephine and her family were living in what was called a boxcar town, a community built from abandoned railroad cars. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a place to live. And for Black families at the time, housing options were already brutally limited. Then came the violence. White mobs attacked the boxcar communities, driven by racial hatred and fueled by labor strikes. The people who lived there, poor Black families just trying to survive, were suddenly targets. Homes were destroyed, lives were shattered. Overnight, Josephine and her siblings were left homeless once again. Imagine being 11 years old, standing in the ashes of the only place you had to call home, realizing that society saw your existence as disposable. That was Josephine's reality. Her family moved into overcrowded tenement housing, and survival became even more desperate. Every member of the family had to work, children included. For Josephine, this was the moment she started to feel truly trapped. She had been working since she was 7, scraping by for pennies, and still nothing changed. No matter how much she worked, hunger always returned. No matter how much she endured abuse, always found her. She felt like she was stuck in a cruel cycle that would never end. But Josephine had something many others around her didn't: imagination. Even in the darkest corners of her life, she dreamed. She dreamed of stages of applause, of gowns that sparkled under the lights. She held on to the fantasy of transforming herself the way a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. And those dreams weren't just daydreams anymore, they were starting to feel like a plan. Still, the hardships continued. By 13, Josephine entered into her first marriage. The man's name was Willie Wells, a steelworker who was more than 10 years older than she was. In today's world, it's unthinkable a child forced into a relationship with a grown man. But back then, in poor Black communities, child marriages weren't uncommon. Girls were seen as burdens to be passed on mouths to be fed by someone else. For Josephine, it was not a love story. It was an escape attempt that turned into another cage. The marriage was marked by violence and instability. Willie was abusive, and after one particularly brutal fight, he walked out of her life for good. Josephine was only 13 years old, abandoned yet again. But here's where her spirit shows itself once more. Instead of letting the failed marriage break her, Josephine made a vow she would not spend the rest of her life trapped in St. Louis. She knew deep in her bones that nothing good was waiting for her there. And she had an idea of how to get out. Around that time, Josephine discovered a local performance group called the Dixie Steppers. They were a musical variety troupe, and when she watched them on stage, something lit up inside of her. She memorized every line, every dance move. To her friends, she joked about auditioning. But it wasn't really a joke. She was deadly serious. One night after a performance, Josephine lingered outside the stage door. She convinced security she had an appointment, and somehow she found herself standing in front of the director. She begged him for a chance. At first, he brushed her off. But Josephine was persistent. She showed him some of her moves, raw, untrained, but magnetic. Something about her energy, the way she lit up a room, made him stop and take notice. Against the odds, he gave her a spot. For Josephine, this was everything. Finally, she had a foot in the door of the world she had always dreamed about. But as always, success didn't come easily. The other girls in the troupe mocked her. She didn't have formal training. Her style was too wild, too unconventional. She stood out, and not in the way they approved of. Still, Josephine had learned a lesson back in school: when people laugh at you, you can either shrink, or you can take control of the laughter. On stage, she leaned into her awkwardness, turning mistakes into comedy. She crossed her eyes, exaggerated her movements, and made audiences laugh until their sides hurt. What the chorus girls saw as clumsy, the audience saw as refreshing. Before long, Josephine went from the girl everyone doubted to the girl audiences couldn't stop talking about. She had gone from servant to child bride to entertainer, all before the age of 15. This was the official end of her childhood. There would be no teenage years spent daydreaming about crushes, no carefree afternoons playing outside. From here on out, Josephine was a performer, a breadwinner, and a fighter. And although the road ahead would be filled with just as much struggle as triumph, one thing was clear: Josephine Baker had found her stage. And with that stage came the first glimpse of the life she had always imagined, one where laughter replaced tears, applause replaced insults, and Josephine for the first time was seen not as a burden, but as someone unforgettable. Her childhood may have been stolen from her, but she was determined that her future would belong entirely to her. Chapter 4: Love Loss and the First Stage Lights. By the time I hit my teenage years, I was already living in a world that had very little patience for childhood dreams. Survival left no room for innocence. And yet somehow I still carried this fire inside me, this conviction that life could be bigger than poverty, bigger than St. Louis, bigger than the abuse I'd endured. After my first marriage fell apart, I wasn't just heartbroken, I was determined. I had tasted what it felt like to be trapped, and I swore I would never let that happen again. So when the chance to perform came along, I grabbed it with both hands, even if I wasn't fully ready. The Dixie Steppers became my world. At first, I was just a background dancer, shoved to the edges, laughed at by the other girls. But the audience saw something in me. They laughed too, but it wasn't cruel laughter this time. It was joy. My clumsy movements, my exaggerated faces, they were fresh, unpredictable, alive. Every night I walked onto that stage, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, people weren't looking past me or down on me. They were looking at me. It wasn't all applause, though. Off stage, the same struggles followed me. Money was still scarce, and work in a troupe barely paid enough to eat. I was still just a teenager caught between a child's vulnerability and an adult's responsibilities. And like many young women before me, I searched for stability in love. That's how I met William Baker. He wasn't like Willie, my first husband. William was steadier, calmer. He supported my performing, encouraged it even, which was rare at the time. Most men wanted their wives at home, raising children, not dancing on stage. With William for a while, I thought maybe I had found someone who could stand by me without trying to cage me. We married quickly, too quickly, and for a brief moment it felt like life might finally settle. But deep down, I wasn't built for domestic life. I wasn't meant to wash dishes and wait for my husband to come home. I wanted stages, music, costumes, laughter. And as much as William tried, marriage couldn't fill that hunger. The union didn't last long, but it gave me something I would carry forever: his name. From then on, I was Josephine Baker. That name would soon light up theaters and echo across continents. With or without a husband, I was determined to chase the life I wanted. I took whatever jobs I could find in clubs and theaters, often performing the same comedic routine again and again. I'd twist my face into silly expressions, stumble around the stage, anything to make people laugh. Some nights the crowds roared, other nights they barely noticed me. But every performance was a step away from St. Louis, and a step toward the future I envisioned. And yet, there was a ceiling. No matter how much talent I showed, no matter how many laughs I drew, I was still a black woman in America in the 1920s. Opportunities had limits, doors stayed closed, and the dream of breaking out of small-time clubs felt almost impossible. Still, I refused to believe that was all there was for me. I'd already survived too much to give up now. And the more I performed, the more I realized something important: audiences didn't just want polished dancers and perfect routines. They wanted personality. They wanted someone unforgettable. and that more than anything else was what I could give them. So I leaned into it. I became the girl who could make you laugh when you least expected it. The one who turned mistakes into magic. The one who looked like she didn't belong on stage, but somehow made the stage her own. Every night I performed, I wasn't just entertaining strangers, I was proving something to myself. I was proving that I could rise above the world that tried to break me, that I could turn humiliation into art, pain into power. And even though my path was still uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to the girl with one dress, the servant no one wanted, the child people discarded. I was Josephine Baker now, and this was only the beginning. Chapter 5. On the road and out of St. Louis. Leaving St. Louis felt like leaving behind a prison. I had grown up believing that survival meant scrubbing floors, shoveling snow, or enduring cruelty in someone else's home. But when I boarded that train with a performing troupe, I realized survival could also mean reinvention. I could be someone new. I could be someone free. The Dixie Steppers were my ticket out. I knew every word of their shows, every step of their dances long before I ever joined them. I had studied from the shadows, dreaming of the day I'd step into the spotlight. And when I finally did, it was messy, chaotic, unpolished, but unforgettable. On tour, I discovered something that would become my greatest strength. Audiences loved me not in spite of my differences, but because of them. While the other dancers glided gracefully, I tripped, I flailed, I pulled faces, and the crowd roared with laughter. It reminded me of school when the bullies teased me for wearing the same dress every day. Back then, I learned that if I laughed with them, I could take control. On stage, I turned that childhood defense into performance art. My awkwardness became comedy. My comedy became power. But touring wasn't glamorous. We traveled by train from town to town, living on little money, often facing the harsh racism of early 20th century America. Hotels turned us away. Restaurants refused to serve us. Some nights, we slept in cramped quarters, huddled together, hungry and tired. Yet every time the curtain rose, I gave the audience everything I had. Because for those minutes on stage, I wasn't poor, I wasn't unwanted, I wasn't invisible. I was Josephine Baker. It was during this time that I crossed paths with Clara Smith, one of the most celebrated blues singers in the country. Clara was known as the Queen of the Moaners, a voice so rich and haunting it could silence a room. I admired her long before we met, but when I finally did, it changed the course of my life. I wasn't introduced to Clara as a star, not at first. I was just a teenager helping backstage when one night she had a wardrobe mishap, stains on her costume before a big performance. Most people would panic, but I had spent years scrubbing washing patching. I rushed in and fixed it for her, quick and efficient. She noticed, and in that small act she saw something in me. Clara offered me a job as her dresser, traveling with her across the country. To me, it was everything. I wasn't just escaping St. Louis, I was stepping into the orbit of greatness. Traveling with Clara meant exposure to the heart of the music world, meeting other performers, watching how real professionals commanded a stage. She became a mentor, teaching me not just about performance, but about resilience. With Clara, I also discovered more about myself. I was still so young, barely 15, but my life had forced me into adulthood early. Around Clara, I felt both protected and challenged. Some say we were romantically involved, and while the details often get blurred by rumor, what mattered most was that I finally felt seen. After years of being dismissed here was someone who valued me, who believed I had a place in the world of entertainment. But life on the road wasn't only about discovery, it was also about heartbreak. I fell in love again this time with a man named William Baker. He was steady, supportive, and unlike the violent man I had married back in St. Louis, he seemed safe. We married quickly, too quickly. Looking back, I think I was desperate for stability, desperate to believe that love could be a refuge. The marriage didn't last. I was too restless, too ambitious, and the truth was, I didn't want to be defined as anyone's wife. But from that marriage, I gained something invaluable, a name. I kept his surname, Baker, and with it, I shed the identity of the unwanted girl from St. Louis. From then on, the world would know me as Josephine Baker. By now, I was performing more regularly, not just in chorus lines, but in leading roles. I'd perfected my comedic routines using clumsiness and exaggeration to stand out. The crowds adored it. But as much as audiences laughed, I felt a creeping sense of limitation. In America, especially as a black woman, there was only so far I could rise. Theaters loved my antics, but they weren't offering me the opportunities to evolve. The color line in the United States was a wall I couldn't break through. I could make audiences laugh, but I couldn't make the industry take me seriously. I could headline in certain venues, but the mainstream stages, the biggest stages, remained out of reach. And so the hunger in me grew. Hunger, not just for food, which was still often scarce, but for freedom. Hunger for a world where my skin color wouldn't dictate my worth. Hunger for a stage big enough to hold all of me, the comedy, the beauty, the power. Every night as the trains carried us from city to city, I would press my forehead against the cold glass of the window and imagine places far beyond the towns we passed. I imagined Paris, where I'd heard the streets buzzed with art, fashion, and music. I imagined a city where audiences might see me not as a curiosity, not as a joke, but as an artist. The dream grew louder with every mile. America had given me my start, but I knew it would never give me my future. If I wanted to truly become Josephine Baker, I would have to leave. That moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. And I could feel it like a pulse under the surface of everything I did. Chapter 6: Paris, the stage that changed everything. By the time I turned 19, I felt like I had already lived a dozen different lives. I had been a child laborer, a runaway, a chorus girl, a wife twice over, and an entertainer scraping my way from one city to the next. But the hunger inside me only grew louder. I wanted more than survival. I wanted transformation. Then the offer came a chance to dance in Paris. Paris. The word itself felt like magic. To a girl who had grown up in poverty in St. Louis, it was another planet. I had heard whispers of the city, its art, its fashion, its open-mindedness, its nightlife that glittered until dawn. In Paris, they said people didn't look at you through the same lens of race. They looked at you for what you brought to the stage, for the energy you gave. Still, I was terrified. America was the only world I knew. Crossing the ocean meant stepping into the unknown, a place where failure could leave me stranded and forgotten. But I also knew that staying meant hitting a ceiling I could never break. So I packed my courage along with my costumes, boarded a ship, and sailed into the next chapter of my life. The moment I arrived in Paris, I knew I had made the right choice. The air was charged with possibility. The streets were alive with music and laughter, and everywhere I turned, people were dressed like works of art. Fashion wasn't just clothing, it was identity, expression, rebellion. And most importantly, I wasn't treated like an oddity. I wasn't pushed to the margins. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. My debut was at a cabaret not far from the Moulin Rouge. It wasn't the biggest venue in Paris, but it was influential, a place where the city's artists and intellectuals gathered to see something daring, something new. And I was nothing if not new. That first night, my nerves rattled inside me like a drum. Backstage, I paced, running my hands over the rubber bananas that made up my skirt. Yes, bananas. Bright yellow, ridiculous, and daring. The outfit was scandalous, even by Parisian standards, but that was the point. I wasn't there to blend in. I was there to explode. When the curtain rose and the music began, something wild overtook me. I wasn't the clumsy little girl from St. Louis anymore. I wasn't the bullied child with only one dress. I wasn't even the chorus girl desperate to keep her spot. I was Josephine Baker, and the stage was mine. I danced with abandon, my arms flailing my hips, snapping my face full of expressions that ranged from sultry to downright goofy. It wasn't graceful, not in the traditional sense. It was raw, experimental, alive. The audience gasped, then they laughed, then they applauded so loudly the floor seemed to vibrate beneath me. By the end of the performance, the entire room was on its feet. Paris had never seen anything like me. The reviews poured in. Some critics tried to diminish me with racially charged stereotypes, calling me exotic, primitive, or mocking the way I moved. But others recognized something bigger, that I was breaking boundaries, shattering expectations of what performance could be. One admirer, the great writer Ernest Hemingway, called me the most sensational woman anyone ever saw. I held on to those words, because for once people weren't laughing at me. They were laughing with me, celebrating me. Overnight, I went from an unknown chorus girl to a star. My name was everywhere, on posters and newspapers, on the lips of Parisians who crowded into theaters to see me. Josephine Baker wasn't just a performer anymore. I was a symbol of Paris itself, daring, stylish, unpredictable. And with fame came opportunity. My likeness appeared on dolls, perfumes, cocktails. Women across the city imitated my hairstyle, a sleek, shiny crop with curls painted across the forehead. I even launched my own hair product, Baker Fix, which became a bestseller for decades. Imagine that a girl once bullied for wearing the same old dress now had women across Europe buying products to look like her. But the stage wasn't just about glamour, it was about freedom. For the first time in my life, I had complete creative control. No one told me how to move or what to wear. I was free to explore, to shock, to delight, to own my body and my voice in ways I never could in America. On stage, I wasn't just performing, I was rewriting the rules of who I could be. Still, fame wasn't without its shadows. Behind the applause, there were whispers. Some people came to gawk rather than to celebrate. Some still reduced me to caricature, refusing to see the artistry in my performance. But I had grown used to that. What mattered was that I had power, now the power to draw audiences, the power to choose my path. And Paris gave me more than just an audience. It gave me love, or at least what I thought was love. His name was Giuseppe Abatino. He introduced himself as a count, a wealthy Italian aristocrat with charm and sophistication. He wore a monocle, carried himself like royalty, and whispered words that made me feel like I was finally safe in someone's arms. I fell for him hard. He told me he could guide my career, manage my money, make me into more than just a performer. And I believed him. I let him into my life, into my work, into my heart. My friends didn't trust him. They said there was something off, that his stories didn't add up. But I didn't listen. I was too enchanted. After all, hadn't my entire life been built on transformation, on leaving one identity behind to claim another? Maybe I wanted to believe that Giuseppe was who he said he was because it fit the fairy tale I was living. Together we opened a nightclub, Chez Josephine, a glamorous venue that drew crowds eager to sip overpriced cocktails just to be near me. It felt like everything I had ever dreamed of, a stage, a business, a love story. And when the newspapers announced our marriage, even in America, it seemed like the perfect ending to my rags to riches story. But life rarely delivers perfect endings. Giuseppe wasn't a count. He wasn't rich. He wasn't even honest. He was a bricklayer from Italy who had invented an entire identity, catfishing me long before the word existed. The marriage announcement, a publicity stunt. Our love story, a carefully crafted lie. When the truth surfaced, I was humiliated, but I was also wiser, because by then I had learned something invaluable. Even lies, if used correctly, could be turned into power. The scandal only drew more attention to me, to my club, to my career. And instead of shrinking, I leaned into it. I poured my energy into my memoir, writing down the chaotic, dizzying story of my life at just 21 years old. Some people thought it was arrogant who writes their memoir that young. But I knew I had already lived a lifetime's worth of struggle and triumph, and the world seemed to agree. My words gave people a glimpse behind the feathers, the bananas, the laughter into the heart of a woman who was tired of being underestimated. But even as I celebrated my success, burnout crept in. I had been working since I was 7 years old. The spotlight was dazzling, but it was also exhausting. The cheers, the costumes, the endless hours, it left me hollow sometimes, craving something deeper, something that wasn't just about entertainment. And then history came crashing down. The 1930s gave way to the 1940s, and the world was plunged into war. As the Nazis spread across Europe, Paris, the city that had embraced me, the city that had made me, was suddenly under threat. For most entertainers, this would have been the end of the story. But for me, it was the beginning of something even more extraordinary. Because everything I had learned as a performer, how to charm, how to distract, how to move unnoticed through a room full of strangers would soon become the very tools that allowed me to fight. I wasn't just Josephine Baker the star. I was about to become Josephine Baker the spy. Chapter 7. The Spy in the Spotlight. When the war came, everything changed. Paris, the city that had given me freedom and love and a stage unlike any other, was suddenly filled with fear. Nazi troops marched in, and overnight the city of light dimmed under the weight of occupation. I could have left. I had money, connections, and the fame to escape, but how could I? Paris had given me everything. The thought of abandoning it, of abandoning the people who had embraced me, felt unthinkable. And so I made a choice. I wouldn't just sing, dance, and perform. I would fight. Now I wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. I didn't carry a rifle or march into battle. My weapon was my fame. My shield was my charm. And my stage became the perfect cover for espionage. It started quietly. The French resistance needed information who the Nazis were meeting, where troops were moving, what plans were unfolding behind closed doors. And as Josephine Baker, I had access. I could walk into embassies, parties, and high society gatherings where German officers boasted carelessly, never imagining the glamorous woman sipping champagne nearby was listening to every word. No one suspected me. I was a star after all. To them, I was harmless, a dancer, a clown, a woman better suited to feathers and laughter than espionage. That was their mistake. And I used it. I began passing secrets, carrying intelligence from one place to another. My sheet music became my code. Hidden in the notes were messages about troop movements, plans, locations, vital information disguised as harmless melodies. If soldiers had stopped me and rifled through my belongings, all they would have seen was a stack of musical scores. They never thought to look closer. Sometimes the information I carried was written in invisible ink scrawled across the margins of my music. Other times I memorized it, performing it in my mind until I could pass it along. My tours became more than performances, they were missions. Every city I visited, every curtain that rose was another chance to smuggle secrets. I wasn't working alone. I had allies within the resistance and within French intelligence. But my fame gave me advantages few others had. While other spies risked being searched at checkpoints, I breezed through. Who would dare strip search Josephine Baker, the darling of Paris? Who would dare accuse me, the woman celebrated in every cabaret, of being anything but frivolous? That underestimation kept me alive. But make no mistake, this wasn't glamorous. Espionage was dangerous. At any moment, discovery meant imprisonment, torture, even execution. I knew the risks every time I stepped on stage. Every laugh from the audience, every curtain call could have been my last. Yet strangely, I felt calmer than I had in years. For once, I wasn't just performing for applause. I was performing for freedom. When Paris became too dangerous, I relocated to my villa in the south of France. From there, I continued working, hosting gatherings where resistance members could meet under the guise of social visits. I used my estate as a hub for information, hiding messages, helping fugitives, doing whatever I could. And even as the war dragged on, I never stopped performing. In North Africa, I sang for Allied troops, lifting spirits while quietly carrying intelligence across borders. I was exhausted, my health often failing, but I refused to stop. Every show, every mission felt like one more step toward victory. The risks caught up with me. At one point, I fell seriously ill and nearly died. My body, worn down from the stress, the travel, and the constant fear, gave out. But I recovered. And when I did, I went right back to the work. Because how could I not? Too many lives were at stake. By the time the war ended, I had carried secrets across continents, smuggled intelligence that saved lives, and used my fame as a shield against suspicion. And when victory finally came, I stood not as Josephine Baker the star, but as Josephine Baker, the soldier of the resistance. For my efforts, I was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Medal of the Resistance by the French government. Later, General Charles de Gaulle himself made me a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, France's highest order of merit. But for me, the greatest honor wasn't the medals. It was knowing that I had fought back, that I hadn't been powerless against the darkness, that the same girl once bullied, abused, and discarded in St. Louis had stood up to the Nazis and played her part in saving lives. You see, espionage wasn't just about strategy or secrets. For me, it was about reclaiming my power in a world that had so often tried to silence me. On stage, I made audiences laugh and cheer. In the shadows, I helped keep hope alive. And in both roles, I proved that women, especially women underestimated, could change history. But even with victory, my work wasn't done. Because when the guns quieted and the war ended, another battle remained. One I had carried with me my entire life. The battle against racism. Chapter 8. A different kind of battle. The war had ended, Europe was breathing again, and I could have stayed in the glow of my medals and the glamour of Paris. I had fought, I had survived, and I had been honored by France itself. For many, that would have been enough. But for me, the war had revealed something deeper. When the Nazis marched into Paris, I saw how hatred could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. I saw how prejudice left unchecked could poison entire nations. And I realized this wasn't just a European problem. It was something I had known all my life, even before I ever set foot in Paris. It was racism. I had escaped America's cruelty by crossing the ocean. In Paris, I had felt free for the first time, free to perform, free to love, free to exist as Josephine Baker without apology. But I never forgot the girl who had been bullied in St. Louis. I never forgot the humiliation of being turned away from hotels and restaurants because of the color of my skin. And now, after the war, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had fought against the Nazis. Now it was time to fight against racism at home. When I returned to the United States, I was greeted as a celebrity. My fame had crossed the ocean with me, and audiences were eager to see the woman who had conquered Paris and defied the Nazis. But the glamour faded quickly. Because as soon as I stepped onto American soil, I was reminded that fame didn't erase the color line. Hotels still turned me away. Restaurants refused to seat me. Some clubs wanted me on their stage but wouldn't let me through the front door. Imagine that you're good enough to entertain their audiences, but not good enough to sit at their tables. I had a choice. I could swallow the insult, accept the checks, and move on. Or I could stand my ground. I chose to fight. I refused to perform for segregated audiences. If a theater wouldn't allow black people and white people to sit together, then Josephine Baker would not perform on that stage. Some venues gave in because they wanted me badly enough. Others slammed their doors shut, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to compromise. In 1963, I marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington. I stood before the crowd wearing my Free French uniform, the very one I had worn as a member of the resistance. Looking out at thousands of faces, I felt the same fire I had felt during the war. The enemy was different, but the fight was the same dignity, freedom, equality. And yet my activism wasn't only public. It was personal. You see, after the war, I began building what I called my rainbow tribe. I adopted children from all over the world, boys and girls of every race, every background. I wanted to prove something, that people of different colors and religions could live together as brothers and sisters. We lived at my estate in France, Les Mélandes, which became a kind of experiment in love and equality. Tourists came to see us not because we were perfect, but because we represented a possibility. A vision of the world as it could be, not as it was. It wasn't easy. Raising that many children required resources I didn't always have. Money slipped through my fingers faster than I could earn it. There were times when the bills piled up, when the estate felt too heavy to maintain, when I wondered if I had taken on more than I could handle. But I held on because for me, the Rainbow Tribe wasn't just a family. It was a statement. Still, the United States remained a place of pain for me. No matter how much I gave, no matter how loudly I fought, I was often treated as an outsider. Some accused me of being too radical. Others dismissed me as an entertainer who should stick to dancing. And when I spoke out against segregation, the FBI labeled me a threat, watching me like a criminal for daring to demand equality. But I never backed down. Even when America tried to silence me, I kept raising my voice. Even when I lost my estate at Les Mélandes, due to financial struggles, I kept pushing forward. Because I knew my life was bigger than one stage, one house, or one headline. I had been a child scraping by in St. Louis. I had been a dancer who turned clumsiness into comedy. I had been a star who conquered Paris and a spy who risked her life against the Nazis. And now I was a woman standing in front of the world demanding justice. My battles didn't end neatly. Activism rarely does. But if my life had taught me anything, it was this change comes when people dare to step into roles no one expects them to play. I had been underestimated my entire life, and every time I used it to my advantage. In America, they said a black woman could never be a star. In Paris, I became the most celebrated entertainer of my time. The Nazis thought a glamorous dancer could never be a spy. I smuggled secrets across borders under their noses. Segregationists believed performers should stay silent. I stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and demanded freedom. So no, my story didn't end with applause or with medals or even with my rainbow tribe. My story was about more than me. It was about showing the world what happens when you refuse to stay in the box they put you in. I had spent my entire life dancing on the edges of expectation. And with every step, every risk, every fight, I tried to push the world a little closer to the future it deserved. Chapter 9. A Legacy. Larger than life. By the time my story neared its end, I had worn so many masks that even I sometimes struggled to recognize the girl I once was. Frida Josephine McDonald from St. Louis had been poor, unwanted, and overlooked. Josephine Baker of Paris had been a star, a spy, an activist, a mother. But beneath every title, every performance, every fight, there was always the same truth. I wanted the world to be bigger, kinder, freer than the one I had been born into. When I passed away in 1975, I could not have imagined the farewell that awaited me. Paris, the city that had embraced me when America turned me away, gave me a funeral fit for a national hero. More than 20,000 people lined the streets watching as my casket passed by. The French military gave me a full honors funeral, the first American-born woman ever to receive such recognition. Cannons fired, soldiers marched, and a nation bowed its head. I had lived to make audiences laugh, to thrill them, to stir their hearts. But in the end, I was honored not just as an entertainer, but as a fighter, as someone who had risked her life for freedom. And that, to me, was the greatest standing ovation of all. Yet my story didn't end in 1975. Decades later, in 2021, France made a decision that would echo far beyond my lifetime. They reinterred me in the Pantheon, the mausoleum where the nation's greatest heroes rest. Think about that for a moment, the little girl once told by her own mother that she was worthless buried alongside Voltaire, Rousseau, and Victor Hugo. A black woman, an immigrant, a dancer, a spy recognized as one of France's immortals. For me, it was proof that history can shift, that the lives once dismissed as unworthy can, in time, be seen for what they truly were, extraordinary. But honors and monuments are not the real measure of a life. The real question is this: what did you leave behind? For me, it was never just about applause or medals. It was about possibility. I wanted to show that a girl who had nothing could still become everything, that comedy could be courage, that glamour could be armor, that love could be resistance. I wanted to show that the world doesn't change when we play the roles we're given. It changes when we dare to rewrite the script. And so my legacy lives on. Not only in the stages of Paris or in the medals I wore across my chest, but in every woman who refuses to be silenced, in every artist who turns pain into beauty, in every activist who fights for justice, even when the world tells them to sit down and be quiet. Sometimes people ask, was Josephine Baker a star, or a spy, or a mother, or a civil rights leader? The truth is, I was all of those things. And that is what makes my story so human. We are never just one thing. We are many. We are contradictions. We are chaos and brilliance and fragility all at once. That's why my story still matters today, because it reminds us that identity is not a cage, but a stage. And every time we step onto it, we have the chance to surprise the world. When I look back, I think about that little girl in St. Louis, the one with only one dress, the one who turned her pain into comedy just to survive another day of school. She didn't know it then, but she was already preparing to conquer the world. She was already learning the most important lesson of all: when life laughs at you, laugh louder. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: never let them define you. Use every underestimation as fuel. Be bigger than their expectations, braver than their doubts, and louder than their silence. Because somewhere out there, another Josephine Baker is waiting. Another child who feels unseen, unheard, unwanted, ready to rise, ready to fight, ready to dance their way into history. And maybe, just maybe when the curtain falls on all of us, we'll have left behind a world that is just a little bit freer than the one we were born into. That is the legacy I leave you. That is the life of Josephine Baker. And that, my friends, is the story of Josephine Baker. A woman who was never just one thing. Never just a dancer, never just a spy, never just an activist. She was all of it. She turned the hardships of her childhood into fuel, turned laughter into power. Turned her fame into a weapon against tyranny and racism. Her life reminds us that identity isn't fixed, it's fluid. That we are never limited to the roles the world tries to force on us. And most of all, her story echoes across time, because it shows us how one person's courage can ripple into history. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories where history, crime, and humanity collide. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of rewriting your own story.